The morning sun cast long shadows across Paradise Beach when local fisherman Miguel Santos made a discovery that would send shock waves through the aviation world. What should have been another peaceful dawn turned into the beginning of one of the most chilling mysteries ever connected to the Bermuda Triangle. There, half buried in the sand and twisted beyond recognition, lay a massive aircraft wing bearing the faded registration numbers N427MA. Before we dive into this mystery, please like, subscribe to the channel, and comment on what you think happened. Your opinion could be the key to understanding this story. Miguel had been walking this beach for 20 years, collecting driftwood and checking his nets. The salty Caribbean breeze carried the familiar scent of seaweed. But today, something felt different. The air seemed heavier, charged with tension that made the hair on his arms stand on end. At first glance, he thought it was debris from a recent storm, but as he approached, the metallic glint caught his eye. The wing stretched nearly 30 feet across the sand, its aluminum surface scarred and corroded by saltwater exposure. Barnacles clung to its edges like desperate fingers, and seaweed had woven through the torn metal. Miguel's heart began to race. He had served in the Coast Guard for 15 years before becoming a fisherman. He knew aircraft wreckage when he saw it. But this wasn't just any aircraft. The registration numbers, though faded and partially obscured by marine growth, were still visible enough to send a chill down his spine. N447MMA. Those numbers would soon become seared into the memory of investigators, families, and anyone who dared to dig deeper into what really happened in these notorious waters. With trembling hands, Miguel pulled out his phone and dialed 911. His voice cracked as he tried to explain his discovery. "You need to send someone down here right away," he whispered, as if speaking too loudly might make the wing disappear back into the ocean's depths. The wind picked up suddenly, howling across the beach with supernatural intensity. Palm trees swayed violently overhead, their fronds creating eerie shadows that danced across the wreckage. Miguel felt an overwhelming urge to run, to pretend he had never seen this twisted metal that had emerged from the sea like a ghost. But he stayed. Something told him this discovery was important, that someone, somewhere, had been waiting a very long time for answers. As sirens wailed in the distance, Miguel stared at the wing and wondered, how long had this evidence been hiding beneath the waves? And more importantly, where was the rest of the plane? What he didn't know was that this single wing would unlock a mystery that had haunted families for over 2 years. A mystery that would challenge everything investigators thought they knew about flight safety and the dark secrets beneath the surface of the world's most infamous stretch of ocean. The discovery on Paradise Beach was just the beginning. Within hours of Miguel's call, Paradise Beach transformed into a crime scene. Yellow tape fluttered in the ocean breeze like warning flags, while federal investigators in white hazmat suits carefully photographed every barnacle, every scratch, every piece of evidence that might hold the key to this mystery. NTSB senior investigator Sarah Chen stood at the edge of the cordoned area, her trained eyes scanning the wreckage with the intensity of a predator studying its prey. The salty air stung her nostrils as she crouched beside the wing, her gloved fingers hovering inches above the corroded metal. 23 years of investigating aviation disasters had taught her to read aircraft wreckage like others read books, but this piece told a story that made her stomach turn. The wing belonged to a Cessna Citation, a luxury business jet that should have been carrying no more than 8 passengers. But as Sarah examined the jagged edges where the wing had been torn from the fuselage, she noticed something that didn't belong. Deep gouges ran along the aluminum surface, not the kind made by impact with water or debris, but deliberate, methodical cuts that spoke of human intervention. Her partner, Detective Marcus Rodriguez from the Miami-Dade Police Department, approached with a manila folder clutched in his weathered hands. The expression on his face told Sarah everything she needed to know before he even opened his mouth. This wasn't going to be a simple crash investigation. The registration number N447ME led them to an aircraft owned by Meridian Air Services, a charter company that specialized in discreet flights for high-profile clients. The plane had vanished 2 years and 4 months ago during what should have been a routine flight from Nassau to Miami. On board were 6 passengers and 2 crew members, 8 souls, who had simply disappeared into the notorious waters of the Bermuda Triangle. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn. According to official records, the plane had never been reported missing. Sarah felt the familiar chill that came with uncovering something that powerful people wanted to keep buried. In her experience, when a luxury aircraft carrying wealthy passengers disappears without generating a single missing persons report, it usually meant one of 2 things. Either the passengers weren't supposed to be on that plane, or someone very influential wanted them gone. The forensics team worked methodically around the wing as the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the sand. Each photograph, each measurement, each sample scraped from the corroded surface brought them closer to understanding how this piece of metal had spent over 2 years beneath the Caribbean waves. But as Sarah studied the evidence manifest, one detail made her blood run cold. Embedded deep in the wing's structure, almost invisible to the naked eye, was a small piece of fabric. Red fabric that looked suspiciously like silk. What kind of passenger wears silk on a charter flight? And more importantly, how did that fabric end up embedded in the wing of a plane that supposedly crashed in open water? As the sun began to set over Paradise Beach, Sarah realized they weren't just investigating a plane crash. They were uncovering a carefully orchestrated disappearance that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide. The Meridian Air Services office in downtown Miami felt like a tomb when Sarah and Marcus arrived the following morning. Dust particles danced in the filtered sunlight, streaming through Venetian blinds, and the receptionist's desk sat empty, covered with a thin layer of neglect that spoke of a business long abandoned. Company owner Vincent Torres emerged from his office like a man walking to his own execution. His expensive suit hung loosely on his diminished frame, and dark circles under his eyes suggested months of sleepless nights. When he handed Sarah the passenger manifest for flight N447MA, his hands trembled almost imperceptibly. The names on the list read like a who's who of Miami's elite underworld. Not the kind of passengers who typically chartered luxury jets for legitimate business trips. Elena Vasquez, a real estate mogul with suspected ties to money laundering operations. David Park, a tech entrepreneur whose companies had been under federal investigation for cryptocurrency fraud. Marcus Sullivan, a prominent attorney who specialized in defending clients that other lawyers wouldn't touch. Rebecca Torres, Vincent's own sister, a private investigator known for taking cases that regular PIs avoided. But it was the last 2 names that made Sarah's pulse quicken. Dr. James Morrison, a forensic accountant who had been scheduled to testify in a major federal case involving offshore banking schemes, and Sarah Kim, a journalist who had been investigating corruption in South Florida's construction industry. 2 people whose work involved exposing secrets that powerful individuals would kill to protect. 2 people who had disappeared along with this plane, leaving behind families who had been told their loved ones were vacationing in the Caribbean and had simply lost contact. Vincent Torres finally broke his silence, his voice barely above a whisper. They paid cash. $200,000 for a charter to Nassau. No questions asked. I should have known something was wrong when they insisted on flying during the tropical storm warning. Sarah studied his face, noting the way his eyes darted toward the window whenever he spoke, as if expecting someone to be watching. The man was terrified, and had been living with that fear for over 2 years. Marcus pulled up weather reports from the day of the disappearance. The data painted a picture of deteriorating conditions throughout the Bermuda Triangle region. 30-foot swells, winds gusting up to 60 miles per hour, and electrical storms that would have made flying incredibly dangerous for even the most experienced pilot. But Captain Robert Hayes, the pilot of N447MAE, had over 15,000 hours of flight time and a spotless safety record. His co-pilot, Maria Santos, was known for her meticulous pre-flight preparations and conservative approach to weather-related decisions. Neither would have willingly flown into the storm conditions that existed that day, unless they didn't have a choice. The pieces of this puzzle were beginning to form a disturbing picture. 8 people had boarded a plane that should never have taken off, on a flight that was never supposed to be reported missing, during a storm that would have provided perfect cover for making people disappear. As Sarah and Marcus left the abandoned offices of Meridian Air Services, they both understood that they were no longer investigating a simple aircraft accident. They were uncovering a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of South Florida's power structure. A conspiracy that someone had been willing to commit mass murder to protect. The question was, who wanted these 8 people dead badly enough to orchestrate such an elaborate disappearance? And more importantly, were they still out there, watching, waiting to see how close the investigation would come to the truth? The suburban home in Coral Gables, where Dr. James Morrison had lived with his wife and 2 teenage daughters, felt frozen in time. Family photographs lined the mantelpiece. Vacation snapshots, birthday celebrations, graduation ceremonies, all testament to a life that had been brutally interrupted 2 years ago. Linda Morrison sat across from Sarah in her immaculate living room, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. The woman's eyes held the hollow look of someone who had spent 804 days wondering if her husband was alive or dead. Hope and despair battling for control of her heart with each passing sunrise. She had been told that James was attending a financial conference in Nassau. The last text message she received from him read, "Flight delayed due to weather. Will call when I land." That call never came. When Linda contacted the Nassau conference organizers, they had no record of James Morrison being registered to attend. When she called the airline, they claimed no passenger by that name had been on any of their flights. It was as if her husband had simply walked out of their house one morning and vanished into thin air. The Morrison family's story was hauntingly similar to what Sarah discovered when she visited the other victims' relatives. Each family had been given a different explanation for their loved one's absence. Each had been told that their family member was safe, traveling for business or pleasure. Each had been left to wonder and wait and slowly lose hope as days turned to weeks, then months, then years. Sarah Kim's elderly parents, in their small apartment in Little Havana, wept openly as they described their daughter's dedication to exposing corruption in Miami's construction industry. Sarah had been working on a major expose about bribes and kickbacks in city government contracts when she disappeared. Her laptop, containing years of investigative research, had vanished along with her. Rebecca Torres's teenage son showed Sarah his mother's office, a cramped room filled with case files and surveillance equipment. Rebecca had specialized in infidelity cases and missing persons investigations, but in the weeks before her disappearance, she had been acting strangely. She had installed new locks on all the doors, started varying her daily routines, and had begun paying for everything in cash. Mom kept saying someone was watching her, the boy told Sarah, his voice cracking with the weight of memories too heavy for someone his age to carry. She made me promise that if anything happened to her, I should give this to the police. He handed Sarah a small key attached to a safety deposit box number. Inside that box, they discovered Rebecca's final insurance policy, copies of photographs, documents, and recorded conversations that painted a picture of corruption reaching deep into Miami's political and business establishment. The evidence suggested that Rebecca Torres had uncovered something explosive in her final case, something that connected all the passengers on Flight N447MA. They weren't random victims of a charter plane crash. They were carefully selected targets, each one possessing information or skills that made them dangerous to someone powerful. Dr. Morrison had been forensically auditing offshore accounts linked to city contracts, Sarah Kim had been investigating the same construction deals from a journalistic angle. Elena Vasquez had been money laundering profits from those inflated contracts. The others had all been connected to this web of corruption in ways that were only now becoming clear. But what really sent chills down Sarah Chen's spine was the final item in Rebecca Torres's safety deposit box, a photograph of Vincent Torres, the charter company owner, shaking hands with a man whose face would soon become very familiar to the investigation. A man who shouldn't have had any connection to Flight N447MA, but whose involvement would explain why 8 people had to die to protect a secret worth millions of dollars. The families deserved answers, and Sarah was beginning to understand that getting those answers might cost her more than she was prepared to pay. The National Weather Service archives painted a terrifying picture of the night flight N427MA disappeared. Meteorologist Dr. Amanda Foster spread satellite images across her desk like tarot cards, revealing a deadly future, each frame showing the massive tropical system that had been brewing in the Atlantic on that fateful evening. Hurricane Miranda had been a Category 2 storm tracking northeast of the Bahamas, spawning feeder bands of violent thunderstorms that reached deep into the heart of the Bermuda Triangle. Wind shear indicators showed gusts exceeding 70 miles per hour, and radar imagery revealed towering cumulonimbus clouds that stretched up to 40,000 feet. Deadly vertical walls of ice and turbulence that could tear apart even the most robust aircraft. Sarah Chen studied the weather data with growing unease. No responsible pilot would have attempted to fly through these conditions, especially not in a small business jet carrying 8 passengers. The storm system created what meteorologists called a graveyard of storms, a convergence zone where multiple weather fronts collided to create some of the most dangerous flying conditions imaginable. But the most disturbing evidence came from air traffic control recordings that had been archived and forgotten until now. At 8:47 p.m. on the night of the disappearance, Flight N447MA had requested permission to deviate from its filed flight plan. The pilot's voice, captured on crackling radio transmissions, carried an unmistakable note of urgency. Miami approach, citation 427MA, requesting immediate vector to avoid weather. We have severe turbulence and we need to find a gap in this system. The air traffic controller's response was professional but concerned. 447MA, I'm showing solid returns on radar for your entire route. Recommend you return to Nassau and wait for the system to pass. What came next chilled Sarah to the bone. Captain Hayes's final transmission was barely audible through the static. Miami approach. We have situation on board. Cannot return. Repeat, cannot return to Nassau. We need immediate clearance to... And then silence. The radar contact for Flight N447MA had vanished at exactly 9:15 p.m., approximately 60 nautical miles northeast of Bimini, in the deepest waters of the Bermuda Triangle. Search and rescue operations launched at dawn found nothing but empty ocean and the remnants of the storm that had swallowed the plane whole. Or so everyone had believed. Dr. Foster's analysis of the storm patterns revealed something that the original investigators had missed. The wind currents and water temperatures on that night would have created a very specific drift pattern for any debris. According to her calculations, pieces of an aircraft lost in that location should have washed ashore somewhere along the eastern coast of Florida within 18 to 24 months. The timing was perfect. The wing had been found exactly where and when her models predicted it would appear. But there was another possibility that Dr. Foster hesitated to mention, one that would change everything investigators thought they knew about Flight N447MA. Storm systems like Hurricane Miranda didn't just create dangerous flying conditions. They also created perfect cover for aircraft that needed to disappear from radar screens while remaining intact. The weather data showed several gaps in radar coverage during the height of the storm, blind spots where a skilled pilot could have descended below the radar horizon and changed course without being detected. If someone wanted to fake a crash in the Bermuda Triangle, that storm had provided the perfect opportunity. Sarah studied the meteorologist's face, recognizing the expression of someone who had discovered something she wished she hadn't. The evidence was pointing toward a conclusion that defied everything they thought they knew about this case. What if Flight N447MA hadn't crashed in the storm at all? What if the 8 passengers had been taken somewhere else entirely, and the wing on Paradise Beach was nothing more than carefully placed evidence designed to end the investigation before it could begin? The storm had been the perfect cover for something far more sinister than a simple aircraft accident. Captain Robert Hayes's apartment in Aventura was a shrine to a lifetime of flying. Model aircraft lined the shelves, aviation charts covered the walls, and logbooks dating back 30 years chronicled every hour he had spent in the cockpit. But it was what Sarah Chen found hidden behind those logbooks that revealed the truth about the man who had piloted Flight N447MA into oblivion. Hayes had been drowning in debt. Credit card statements showed mounting expenses, overdue mortgage payments, and medical bills for his daughter's cancer treatment that had bankrupted a man who had once been financially stable. In the months before the disappearance, his bank account had been overdrawn repeatedly, and collection agencies had been calling daily. But 3 days before Flight N447MA took off, Hayes's financial situation had changed dramatically. A wire transfer of $250,000 had appeared in his checking account, originating from an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The transaction was labeled simply as "Flight Services Rendered in Advance." Sarah's hands trembled as she photographed the bank statements. Hayes hadn't been an unwilling victim of this conspiracy, he had been a paid participant. But the medical records she found in his bedroom told a story that was far more complex than simple greed. His daughter Emma had been fighting leukemia for 2 years. The experimental treatment she needed cost nearly $500,000, money that insurance wouldn't cover and that Hayes couldn't possibly afford on a pilot's salary. The man had been faced with an impossible choice: watch his child die or compromise his principles to save her life. Co-pilot Maria Santos's story was equally heartbreaking. Sarah discovered that Maria's immigration status had been in jeopardy due to a paperwork error that threatened to separate her from her American-born children. Someone had offered to resolve her legal issues permanently in exchange for her cooperation with Flight N447MA. Both pilots had been carefully selected for their vulnerabilities, their desperate circumstances making them perfect candidates for coercion. But the evidence suggested that neither had fully understood what they were agreeing to when they accepted those payments. Hayes's personal flight journal, hidden in a hollowed-out aviation manual, revealed his growing suspicions about the true nature of their mission. His final entries were filled with anxiety and regret. The passengers seem nervous. Elena Vasquez keeps checking her phone, and the lawyer Sullivan looks like he's expecting trouble. Rebecca Torres won't stop asking questions about our route and why we're flying at night. I think I've made a terrible mistake. The last entry, written just hours before takeoff, was barely legible. Emma's treatment starts next week. I keep telling myself that's all that matters. But these people, I don't think they're going to Nassau. I don't think they're coming back. Security footage from the executive terminal at Miami International Airport captured the passenger's boarding flight. N447MA. The grainy video showed 8 people who appeared to believe they were embarking on a routine charter flight. There were no signs of coercion, no indication that they suspected anything unusual about their journey. But in the background of that footage, barely visible near the edge of the frame, Sarah spotted something that made her blood run cold. A man in a dark suit was watching the boarding process from behind a pillar, speaking quietly into a cell phone. The timestamp on the video showed 7:30 p.m., less than 2 hours before the plane would disappear forever. The man's face was partially obscured by shadows, but his posture and build matched the description of someone who had been connected to similar disappearances throughout the Caribbean. Someone whose name had been whispered in federal investigations for years, but who had never been successfully prosecuted. Someone who made people disappear for a living. As Sarah left Hayes's apartment, she realized that she wasn't just investigating the disappearance of 8 passengers. She was uncovering a murder-for-hire operation that used the Bermuda Triangle as the perfect dumping ground for inconvenient witnesses and whistleblowers. The pilots had been unwilling accomplices in their own tragedy, manipulated by their circumstances into participating in something that would haunt them far longer than they could have imagined. But what happened to those 8 passengers after the plane vanished from radar remained the darkest mystery of all. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a retired Coast Guard helicopter pilot named Jake Morrison, who had been tracking unusual aircraft movements in the Bahamas for his own private research into Bermuda Triangle mysteries. When he heard about the wing discovery on Paradise Beach, he contacted Sarah with information that would shatter every assumption about Flight N447MA's fate. Morrison had been monitoring radio frequencies on the night of the disappearance, hoping to document any strange phenomena during the storm. Instead, he had recorded something far more sinister: encrypted communications between ground control and an aircraft that matched the radar signature of the missing citation. The audio files revealed that Flight N447MA hadn't crashed in the storm. It had landed. Using sophisticated signal analysis equipment borrowed from the FBI, Sarah and her team decoded the communications. The transmissions revealed landing coordinates for a remote island called Cayo Perdido, Lost Key, a privately owned piece of land approximately 90 miles southeast of Nassau that didn't appear on most commercial navigation charts. Satellite imagery of Cayo Perdido showed a small airstrip carved into dense tropical vegetation, surrounded by structures that looked more like a military compound than a private retreat. The island's legal ownership was buried under layers of shell companies and offshore corporations, but the trail eventually led to a name that sent chills through the federal law enforcement community: Anton Volkov, a Russian oligarch with suspected connections to organized crime, money laundering, and contract-killing operations throughout the Caribbean. Volkov had purchased the island through intermediaries 15 years ago, ostensibly as a private vacation retreat. But intelligence agencies had long suspected it served a much darker purpose, as a way station for people who needed to disappear permanently. The revelation that Flight N447NE had landed on Volkov's island raised terrifying questions about the fate of the 8 passengers. Had they been killed immediately upon arrival, or had they been kept alive for interrogation about what they knew regarding the Miami corruption scandal? Aerial reconnaissance photos taken by federal agents showed recent construction activity on the island. New buildings, expanded dock facilities, and what appeared to be a crematorium disguised as a waste management facility. The implications were horrifying, but it was the discovery of aircraft parts scattered in the shallow waters around the island that confirmed Sarah's worst fears. Pieces of N447MA's fuselage, engines, and landing gear had been systematically dismantled and dumped in different locations around the island's reef system. The wing that washed up on Paradise Beach had been deliberately separated from the rest of the wreckage and set adrift to eventually wash ashore and provide closure to any investigation. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to make it appear that the plane had crashed in deep water while actually using the aircraft as a delivery system to bring 8 inconvenient witnesses to their final destination. Marine forensics experts studying the underwater debris field made an even more disturbing discovery. Traces of human DNA were found on several pieces of the aircraft's interior, but the patterns suggested that the passengers had been removed from the plane alive. Bloodstains on the cabin floor indicated struggle and possible violence, but not the kind of massive trauma that would be expected from a fatal crash. The evidence painted a picture of 8 people who had realized too late that their charter flight was actually a one-way journey to hell. They had landed on a remote island controlled by one of the world's most dangerous criminals and they had been systematically eliminated to protect secrets worth millions of dollars. But one final piece of evidence gave Sarah hope that justice might still be possible. Hidden among the aircraft debris, marine investigators found a waterproof container that had somehow escaped detection during the cleanup operation. Inside was a smartphone belonging to journalist Sarah Kim, and its memory card contained video footage that would expose the entire conspiracy. The phone had recorded everything: the landing on Cayo Perdido, the faces of the men who met the plane, and the final moments of 8 people who had stumbled onto something too big and too dangerous for them to survive. Now, Sarah Chen faced the most dangerous decision of her career: how to use this evidence without becoming the next victim of Anton Volkov's cleanup operation. The FBI's Digital Forensics Laboratory in Quantico had processed evidence from some of the most important criminal cases in modern history. But the smartphone recovered from the waters around Cayo Perdido contained footage that left seasoned investigators speechless. Sarah Chen sat in the secure viewing room, her hands clenched as she watched the final hours of 8 innocent people unfold on the monitor screen. The video began during the flight itself. Journalist Sarah Kim had apparently sensed something wrong and started recording covertly. The footage showed passengers who had gradually realized their charter flight was not heading to Nassau as promised. Elena Vasquez could be seen frantically trying to use her phone to call for help, while attorney Marcus Sullivan attempted to convince the pilots to change course. But it was the audio that revealed the true horror of their situation. Captain Hayes's voice, filled with anguish and desperation, could be heard over the engine noise. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. They have my daughter." The plane's descent toward Cayo Perdido was captured in shaky handheld footage that showed the terror in the passengers' faces as they realized they were landing on an unknown island rather than at Nassau International Airport. Dr. Morrison, the forensic accountant, could be seen trying to hide documents in his jacket, while Rebecca Torres, the private investigator, was frantically deleting files from her own phone. The landing itself was smooth, professional. Captain Hayes was too skilled a pilot to crash the plane even under these circumstances. But what happened after the engines shut down transformed the investigation from a missing persons case into a multiple homicide. Armed men surrounded the aircraft within minutes of landing. The video showed faces that federal agencies had been tracking for years: contract killers, money launderers, and enforcers connected to Anton Volkov's criminal empire. Sarah Kim had managed to keep her phone recording even as the passengers were forced off the plane at gunpoint. The footage captured the moment when each passenger realized the true nature of their situation. Elena Vasquez collapsed when she saw the crematorium building in the distance. Dr. Morrison attempted to run, but was quickly subdued. The others stood in stunned silence as they were separated into groups and led toward different buildings on the compound. But the most chilling moment came when Anton Volkov himself appeared on camera. The man was smaller than Sarah had expected, almost unremarkable in appearance, but his presence dominated the scene with an aura of casual menace. He walked among the terrified passengers like a collector, examining new acquisitions, occasionally nodding to his men as he decided each person's fate. The audio captured fragments of conversation that would prove crucial to building a federal case. Volkov could be heard discussing which passengers possessed information that needed to be extracted before they were eliminated. Dr. Morrison and journalist Sarah Kim were taken to an interrogation facility, while the others were immediately led away to what the video suggested was their final destination. The smartphone's recording ended abruptly, but not before capturing something that would haunt Sarah Chen's dreams for years to come. In the final seconds of footage, journalist Sarah Kim had managed to whisper a message directly into the camera lens. "Tell my parents I loved them, and tell the world what happened here." The technical analysis of the video confirmed its authenticity. Metadata, timestamps, and digital signatures all verified that the footage had been recorded on the dates and times consistent with Flight N447MA's disappearance. More importantly, The faces captured in the video matched known associates of Volkov's organization, providing the first direct evidence linking the Russian oligarch to the passengers' murders. But the video also revealed something that filled Sarah with both hope and dread. Dr. Morrison had been kept alive longer than the others, presumably because Volkov needed information about the financial networks he had been investigating. The footage showed him being taken to a separate building that appeared designed for extended interrogation rather than immediate execution. Was it possible that Dr. Morrison had survived longer than the others? Could he still be alive on that island, hidden away as Volkov's prisoner? The possibility that one of the passengers might still be alive transformed the investigation from a quest for justice into a desperate rescue mission. But attempting to save Dr. Morrison would require taking on one of the world's most dangerous criminals on his own heavily fortified island. A mission that could easily result in more deaths rather than answers. The federal task force assembled in a secure conference room in downtown Miami represented the largest joint operation between the FBI, DEA, and Treasury Department in South Florida's history. On the wall-mounted screens, financial flow charts and organizational diagrams revealed the scope of the conspiracy that had cost 8 people their lives, a web of corruption that reached from street-level contractors to the highest offices of city government. Dr. Morrison's forensic accounting work, recovered from encrypted files hidden in Rebecca Torres's safety deposit box, painted a picture of systematic fraud spanning nearly a decade. City construction contracts worth over $200 million had been inflated by an average of 40%, with the excess funds flowing through a complex network of shell companies before ultimately reaching accounts controlled by Anton Volkov's organization. The scheme was elegantly simple and devastatingly effective. Miami's rapid development had created opportunities for massive infrastructure projects, new airports, expanded seaports, luxury residential towers, all funded by taxpayer money and federal grants. Volkov's associates would bid on these contracts through legitimate construction companies they secretly controlled, systematically overbilling for materials, labor, and timeline extensions. The stolen money was laundered through Volkov's Caribbean network before being invested in legitimate businesses throughout South Florida, creating a cycle of corruption that generated hundreds of millions in illegal profits while financing even more elaborate criminal enterprises. But the conspiracy required absolute silence from everyone involved, and that's where the passengers of Flight N447MA had become liabilities rather than assets. Dr. Morrison had been conducting a routine audit of city finances when he discovered the pattern of inflated contracts. His forensic analysis had identified specific transactions, bank routing numbers, and individuals involved in the money laundering operation. Most dangerous of all, he had traced the financial network back to its source, accounts controlled by Anton Volkov. Journalist Sarah Kim had been investigating the construction corruption from a different angle, following tips from city employees who had noticed irregularities in contractor payments. Her research had identified many of the same shell companies and suspicious transactions that Dr. Morrison had discovered through his accounting work. Elena Vasquez, the real estate mogul, had initially been part of the conspiracy, using her legitimate businesses to launder construction fraud profits. But when she learned the true extent of Volkov's criminal empire and realized that people were being killed to protect the operation, she had attempted to withdraw from the scheme and cooperate with federal investigators. Attorney Marcus Sullivan had been providing legal services to several companies involved in the construction fraud. But when he discovered that his clients were connected to murders and international organized crime, he had begun preparing to turn state's evidence against the entire network. Rebecca Torres, the private investigator, had been hired by Dr. Morrison's wife to find her missing husband. But her investigation had uncovered evidence linking the disappearance to the broader conspiracy. The photographs and documents in her safety deposit box showed that she had identified key players in Volkov's organization and was preparing to expose the entire operation. The other passengers, David Park, the tech entrepreneur, and the pilots had been eliminated simply because they had been present when too many secrets were revealed. Volkov's organization couldn't risk leaving any witnesses alive who might eventually remember crucial details or connect seemingly unrelated events. The Federal Task Force now understood that Flight N447MA hadn't been a random charter flight. It had been a carefully orchestrated execution designed to eliminate multiple threats to a criminal empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The passengers hadn't been victims of a plane crash. They had been marks in a sophisticated assassination plot. But uncovering the conspiracy also revealed how deeply Volkov's network had penetrated legitimate institutions throughout South Florida. City officials, construction executives, banking professionals, and even law enforcement personnel had been compromised through bribes, threats, or blackmail. Sarah Chen realized that investigating this case had made her a target. Her team had uncovered evidence that could destroy criminal enterprises worth more money than some small countries' entire economies. And history had shown that people who threatened Anton Volkov's interests had a tendency to disappear just as completely as the passengers of Flight N447MA. The EE question was no longer whether they had enough evidence to pursue prosecution. The question was whether they would live long enough to see justice served. The rescue operation launched at dawn from a military base in Puerto Rico, with Sarah Chen aboard a Coast Guard helicopter that approached Cayo Perdido under cover of a tropical storm system that provided natural concealment from radar detection. Intelligence gathered from satellite surveillance and intercepted communications suggested that Dr. James Morrison might still be alive in the compound's interrogation facility, but the window for rescue was rapidly closing. As the helicopter descended toward the island's rocky coastline, Sarah could see the remnants of Volkov's criminal empire scattered across the landscape like a cancer that had metastasized beyond control. The main compound showed signs of hasty abandonment, documents burning in oil drums, vehicles loaded with equipment preparing for evacuation, and boats departing the island's dock in all directions. The raid team moved through the compound with military precision, but they found most buildings empty, stripped of evidence and equipment. Computer hard drives had been destroyed, filing cabinets stood empty, and even the walls had been scrubbed clean of fingerprints. Volkov's organization had executed a textbook evacuation, leaving behind nothing that could be used in court. But in the underground detention facility beneath the main building, they found him. Dr. James Morrison was barely recognizable after 26 months of captivity. His hair had turned completely white. His body was emaciated from malnutrition, and his eyes held the hollow stare of someone who had witnessed horrors beyond imagination. When the rescue team broke down the door to his cell, he cowered in the corner, convinced that this was another psychological torture session designed to break what remained of his sanity. Sarah knelt beside him, speaking in soft, reassuring tones as medics checked his vital signs. The man who had once been a respected forensic accountant had been reduced to a shadow of his former self. But his mind remained sharp enough to recognize the significance of his rescue. "Linda," he whispered, his voice barely audible through cracked lips. "Is Linda safe?" "My daughters?" The emotion in his voice nearly broke Sarah's composure. Morrison's family had been living under federal protection for months, but they had been told to prepare for the possibility that he was already dead. His wife Linda had aged 10 years in the past 2 years, and his daughters had grown up wondering if their father had abandoned them or been murdered by unknown enemies. As the medical team prepared Morrison for evacuation, he grabbed Sarah's arm with surprising strength. His eyes suddenly focused with laser intensity, and she realized that despite his physical deterioration, the accountant's analytical mind was still functioning. "They kept me alive because they needed the account numbers," he said urgently. "The offshore accounts where they moved the money. But I gave them false information. The real accounts, I memorized them all. Every number, every routing code, every transaction." Morrison's revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation team. For over 2 years, he had been enduring torture and psychological manipulation while protecting financial information that could expose the entire scope of Volkov's money laundering network. The man hadn't just been a victim. He had been a one-man resistance operation, safeguarding evidence that could bring down criminal enterprises across 3 continents. But Morrison's survival came with a terrible cost. As the helicopter lifted off from Cayo Perdido, he began describing what he had witnessed during his captivity. The other passengers hadn't died quickly or peacefully. They had been systematically tortured for information about who else might know about the construction fraud, who they might have shared their discoveries with, and whether any additional evidence existed that could threaten Volkov's operations. Elena Vasquez had lasted 3 days before revealing the locations of hidden financial records. Marcus Sullivan had endured a week of interrogation before admitting that he had prepared a sealed confession for the FBI that would be opened in the event of his death. Rebecca Torres had fought the longest, protecting her sources and contacts for nearly 2 weeks before Volkov's interrogators broke her. Each death had been calculated, methodical, designed to extract maximum information while ensuring that no trace of the passengers would ever be found. Their bodies had been cremated in the facility Sarah had seen in the satellite photos, their ashes scattered in the ocean currents that would carry them far from Cayo Perdido. Morrison had been kept alive only because his financial expertise was essential to accessing the stolen money. But as Volkov's organization prepared to abandon the island and relocate their operations, even that usefulness was coming to an end. "They were going to kill me tomorrow," Morrison whispered as the helicopter raced toward the mainland. They found another accountant who could access the accounts, someone who wouldn't require persuasion. The rescue had succeeded, but Sarah understood that saving Dr. Morrison was only the beginning. His testimony would expose a criminal conspiracy that spanned decades and reached into the highest levels of government and business. But it would also paint a target on his back that would never disappear. Anton Volkov was still out there, and men like him didn't forgive or forget. The federal courthouse in Miami had never seen security measures like those surrounding Dr. James Morrison's testimony. Snipers positioned on surrounding buildings, metal detectors at every entrance, and a motorcade worthy of a head of state escorted the lone survivor of Flight N447ME to his date with justice. Sarah Chen watched from the gallery as the man who had endured 26 months of hell prepared to expose the conspiracy that had destroyed 8 lives. Morrison's physical transformation during his months of recovery had been remarkable, but the psychological scars remained visible to anyone who looked closely. His hands trembled slightly as he raised his right hand to take the oath, and his eyes darted constantly toward the exits, as if calculating escape routes from a lifetime of trained paranoia. The prosecution had built their case around Morrison's testimony, but they knew that defense attorneys would attempt to discredit him as a traumatized victim whose memories couldn't be trusted. What they hadn't expected was the calm, methodical precision with which Morrison began to dismantle Volkov's empire piece by piece. Speaking in the measured tones of a professional accountant, Morrison detailed financial transactions that spanned nearly a decade. He recited account numbers from memory, described money transfers with mathematical precision, and connected seemingly random business deals to a comprehensive pattern of organized crime. His memory, sharpened by 2 years of forced mental exercises designed to protect crucial information, proved to be more reliable than most written records. The courtroom fell silent as Morrison described the final moments of his fellow passengers. His voice never wavered as he detailed Elena Vasquez's desperate attempts to bargain for her life by offering information about other money-laundering operations. He spoke matter-of-factly about Marcus Sullivan's futile efforts to negotiate his release by promising to withdraw his sealed confession from FBI custody. But it was Morrison's description of Rebecca Torres's death that brought tears to the eyes of hardened federal agents. The private investigator had protected her sources and contacts until the very end. Enduring torture that Morrison could barely describe, while refusing to reveal information that might endanger other innocent people. She died protecting people she had never met, Morrison testified, his voice finally cracking with emotion. People who might have become the next passengers on the next flight that disappeared into the Triangle. The defense team's attempts to challenge Morrison's credibility crumbled under the weight of corroborating evidence. Financial records seized from Volkov's abandoned properties matched Morrison's testimony with stunning accuracy. Surveillance footage from Miami's construction sites showed the exact kickback schemes that Morrison described. Even the physical evidence from Cayo Perdido supported his account of what had happened to the missing passengers. But the most powerful moment of his testimony came when Morrison was asked about the psychological impact of his captivity. For the first time, the composed accountant's professional facade cracked completely, revealing the human cost of Volkov's crimes. "They would show me pictures of my family," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "My wife walking to her car, my daughters at school. They wanted me to know that cooperating wouldn't save me. It would only determine whether my family lived or died after I was gone." The revelation that Volkov's organization had been surveilling Morrison's family throughout his captivity sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Linda Morrison, sitting in the front row, visibly paled as she realized how close she and her daughters had come to joining the list of victims. Morrison's testimony continued for 3 days, covering every aspect of the conspiracy, from its origins in legitimate construction contracts to its evolution into a multi-billion-dollar criminal enterprise. He described Volkov's personal involvement in planning the elimination of whistleblowers, detailed the organization's methods for making people disappear without a trace, and provided evidence linking the Russian oligarch to similar disappearances throughout the Caribbean. By the time Morrison stepped down from the witness stand, federal prosecutors had built an ironclad case against not just Volkov, but dozens of co-conspirators throughout South Florida's business and political establishment. The testimony had exposed corruption reaching into City Hall, state government, and even federal agencies that had been compromised through years of systematic bribery and blackmail. But as Morrison was escorted back to his protective custody facility, Sarah Chen couldn't shake the feeling that their victory was incomplete. Volkov himself remained at large, operating from somewhere beyond the reach of American law enforcement. The man who had orchestrated the murders of 7 innocent people was still free, still dangerous, and still capable of striking at anyone who threatened his interests. The trial had provided justice for the victims and their families, but it hadn't eliminated the threat that had created those victims in the first place. Somewhere in the world, Anton Volkov was planning his next move, and Sarah suspected that Dr. Morrison's survival had only made him more determined to complete what he had started. The international manhunt for Anton Volkov spanned 6 continents and involved intelligence agencies from 14 countries, but the Russian oligarch seemed to vanish as completely as his victims had disappeared into the Bermuda Triangle. Interpol red notices, frozen bank accounts, and diplomatic pressure had succeeded in dismantling his financial network and arresting dozens of associates. But Volkov himself remained a ghost, haunting the shadows of international crime. Sarah Chen found herself leading a specialized task force dedicated to tracking the fugitive. But each lead seemed to evaporate just as investigators closed in. Volkov had been spotted in Montenegro, then Kazakhstan, then a private island off the coast of Myanmar. Each sighting proved to be either false, intelligence, or evidence that he had already moved on to another location, always staying one step ahead of the law enforcement agencies pursuing him. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: financial intelligence gathered by Dr. Morrison during his captivity. Hidden among the account numbers and transaction records he had memorized were clues to Volkov's escape routes and backup identities. The Russian had planned for the possibility of exposure, establishing safe houses and financial resources in countries without extradition treaties with the United States. Morrison's analysis revealed a pattern in Volkov's money movements that suggested he was preparing for a final, massive transaction, liquidating assets and consolidating resources for what appeared to be either a permanent disappearance or a return to criminal activities on an even larger scale. The trail led Sarah's team to a remote shipping facility in the port of Hamburg, where intelligence indicated that Volkov was planning to move a cargo container filled with cash, gold, and incriminating documents. The operation required coordination between German federal police, American FBI agents, and Interpol investigators who had been tracking different aspects of Volkov's network. But as the international team prepared to raid the shipping facility, they discovered that they weren't the only ones hunting Anton Volkov. Russian intelligence agents had been tracking their fugitive oligarch for reasons that had nothing to do with American justice. Volkov's criminal empire had apparently made enemies in Moscow as well as Miami, and the race to capture him had become a three-way competition between American law enforcement, German authorities, and Russian state security. The warehouse raid turned into a deadly confrontation that left 2 Russian agents dead, and Volkov once again escaped into the night. But the shipping container he had been preparing to move contained evidence that revealed the true scope of his criminal activities. Documents showing connections to terrorist financing, human trafficking networks, and assassination plots targeting government officials in multiple countries. Among the recovered materials was a leather-bound journal written in Volkov's own handwriting, detailing his plans for revenge against everyone who had contributed to the exposure of his empire. Dr. Morrison's name appeared at the top of the list, followed by Sarah Chen, federal prosecutors, and even the families of his victims. The journal revealed that Volkov viewed the destruction of his Bermuda Triangle operation not as a defeat, but as a temporary setback in a longer campaign. He had spent decades building criminal networks that extended far beyond the construction fraud conspiracy that had brought him to American attention. The Miami operation had been just one tentacle of an organization that spanned the globe. But the most chilling entry in Volkov's journal described his plans for a new phase of operations. Having learned that traditional money laundering and corruption schemes were vulnerable to forensic accounting and investigative journalism, he was pivoting toward more direct methods of eliminating threats. The journal outlined plans for systematic assassination campaigns targeting law enforcement officials, prosecutors, and witnesses who might threaten his interests. The recovered documents also revealed that Volkov had been studying the Morrison case, analyzing how Dr. Morrison had survived his captivity and what mistakes had been made in the original operation. The Russian was preparing to implement improvements to his elimination protocols that would ensure no future witnesses would survive to testify against his organization. As Sarah studied Volkov's journal, she realized that the investigation that had begun with a wing washing up on Paradise Beach had evolved into something far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. They weren't just pursuing a fugitive criminal. They were racing to prevent a campaign of terror that could claim dozens of innocent lives. The manhunt for Anton Volkov had become a fight for the survival of everyone who had dared to challenge his empire. And somewhere in the world, the Russian oligarch was preparing to demonstrate that some secrets were worth killing for, no matter how many people had to die to protect them. Intelligence reports suggested that Volkov was planning to make his move within days, but the target of his revenge operation remained unknown. The only certainty was that anyone connected to the Flight N-447MA investigation had become a potential victim in a war that showed no signs of ending. The anonymous tip came through encrypted channels at 3:47 a.m., providing coordinates for a luxury yacht anchored in international waters between the Bahamas and Bermuda, the heart of the triangle where this nightmare had begun. Intelligence analysis confirmed that the vessel belonged to one of Volkov's shell companies, and satellite imagery showed unusual activity, suggesting that the Russian oligarch was preparing for his final play. Sarah Chen stood on the deck of the Coast Guard cutter as it approached the coordinates through rolling seas that seemed to pulse with the memory of all the lives lost in these waters. The yacht Tsarina gleamed white against the dark ocean, its elegant lines masking the evil that had used these same waters as a graveyard for inconvenient witnesses. As federal agents prepared for what could be their last chance to capture Volkov, intercepted communications revealed the true nature of his plan. The yacht wasn't just a hideout, it was a floating command center from which he intended to coordinate simultaneous assassinations of everyone connected to the Flight N447MAA investigation. Dr. Morrison, his family, Sarah herself, and dozens of others were scheduled to die within the next 24 hours. The boarding operation began at dawn, with tactical teams approaching from multiple directions, while overhead surveillance monitored every movement on the yacht's deck. But as agents rappelled onto the vessel, they discovered that Volkov had been expecting them. The yacht's main salon had been transformed into a command center filled with photographs, dossiers, and detailed plans for eliminating every person who had contributed to exposing his empire. Monitors showed live surveillance feeds from outside Dr. Morrison's safe house, Sarah's apartment building, and the homes of federal prosecutors who had built the case against Volkov's organization. In the center of this nightmare gallery sat Anton Volkov himself, no longer the unremarkable figure from the Cayo Perdido footage, but a man transformed by rage and desperation into something far more dangerous. His eyes held the cold calculation of someone who had accepted that his empire was lost, but was determined to exact revenge before disappearing forever. "Agent Chen," he said calmly, as Sarah entered the salon with her weapon drawn. "I've been looking forward to meeting the woman who destroyed 20 years of careful work." The confrontation that followed would be burned into Sarah's memory forever. Volkov showed no remorse for the murders he had ordered, no regret for the families he had destroyed. Instead, he spoke with pride about the efficiency of his elimination protocols and expressed disappointment that Dr. Morrison's survival had forced him to abandon his Caribbean operations. But as federal agents secured the yacht and arrested Volkov's remaining associates, the Russian oligarch revealed one final twist that sent chills through everyone present. The assassination teams he had deployed weren't operating on a traditional timeline. They were following contingency protocols that would be triggered automatically if he failed to send coded cancellation signals every 12 hours. "You have 6 hours," Volkov said, with a smile that held no warmth. 6 hours to find and stop teams that have been planning these operations for months. Teams that know their targets' routines, security measures, and weaknesses better than the targets know themselves. The race against time that followed tested every resource of federal law enforcement. While Volkov was transported to a secure facility, Sarah coordinated simultaneous protective operations across multiple states as agents scrambled to intercept assassination teams that had already begun moving toward their targets. Dr. Morrison's family was evacuated from their safe house just minutes before explosives detonated in the building next door. Sarah's own apartment was found to contain sophisticated surveillance equipment that had been monitoring her movements for weeks. Federal prosecutors discovered that their court schedules had been obtained through compromised security systems, allowing Volkov's teams to plan attacks during vulnerable moments. But the most chilling discovery came when agents raided a warehouse in Newark that served as the assassination operations headquarters. The facility contained detailed profiles of over 200 individuals connected to various investigations of Volkov's criminal empire. Prosecutors, agents, accountants, journalists, and family members who had all been marked for elimination. The scope of Volkov's revenge plan revealed the true extent of his criminal network and explained why he had been willing to risk capture by remaining in American waters. He hadn't been planning to escape justice. He had been planning to destroy the justice system's ability to threaten future operations by eliminating everyone who had proven capable of exposing organized crime. As the sun set over the waters where Flight N447MA had disappeared, federal agents succeeded in intercepting the last of Volkov's assassination teams. The final confrontation had prevented a massacre that would have claimed dozens of innocent lives, but the victory came with the sobering realization of how close they had come to catastrophic failure. Anton Volkov was finally in custody, his empire dismantled, and his revenge thwarted. But as Sarah Chen watched the yacht Tsarina being towed toward port, she understood that they had witnessed something unprecedented. A criminal organization sophisticated enough to plan the systematic elimination of an entire federal investigation. The case that had begun with a wing washing up on Paradise Beach had revealed depths of corruption and violence that challenged everything law enforcement thought they knew about organized crime in the modern world. 2 years after Anton Volkov's conviction on 47 counts of murder, conspiracy, and racketeering, Sarah Chen returned to Paradise Beach, where this extraordinary case had begun. The morning sun cast the same long shadows across the sand, but the weight of knowledge had transformed this peaceful stretch of coastline into a monument to the 8 souls who had paid the ultimate price for stumbling onto one of the most sophisticated criminal conspiracies in modern history. Dr. James Morrison stood beside her, no longer the broken man who had been rescued from Cayo Perdido, but still bearing the invisible scars of his 26-month ordeal. His family had slowly rebuilt their lives under new identities in a location known only to federal marshals, but the healing process would continue for years to come. The memorial service held that morning had brought together families who had waited years for answers about their missing loved ones. Linda Morrison finally had closure about her husband's disappearance. Sarah Kim's elderly parents could grieve for their daughter, knowing that her sacrifice had exposed corruption worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Rebecca Torres's son could honor his mother's memory with the knowledge that her final investigation had saved countless future victims. The trials that followed Volkov's arrest had resulted in convictions for over 60 individuals connected to the conspiracy, from city officials who had accepted bribes to contract killers who had eliminated witnesses. The construction fraud network that had generated hundreds of millions in illegal profits was dismantled completely, with recovered assets being used to compensate victims and fund new oversight programs. But perhaps the most important outcome was the transformation of how federal agencies approached organized crime investigations. The Volkov case had demonstrated that modern criminal enterprises could operate on a scale and with a sophistication that required entirely new approaches to law enforcement. The Bermuda Triangle, long associated with mysterious disappearances and unexplained phenomena, had revealed its most sinister secret, that it served as the perfect cover for making inconvenient people vanish forever. The remote islands, complex jurisdictional boundaries, and vast expanses of deep water had created an ideal environment for criminals who specialized in making problems disappear. Sarah's investigation had uncovered evidence linking Volkov's organization to at least 12 other mysterious disappearances in the Caribbean over the past decade. Private aircraft, luxury yachts, and even commercial fishing vessels that had vanished without a trace were now being re-examined as potential elimination operations rather than simple accidents or equipment failures. As Sarah walked along the shoreline where Miguel Santos had made his fateful discovery, she reflected on the chain of events that had brought them to this moment. A single piece of aircraft wreckage, weathered by months in the ocean and covered with barnacles, had been the thread that unraveled an international criminal empire. The wing that had washed up on this beach had been intended as the final piece of evidence in a cover-up designed to provide closure without revelation. Volkov's organization had planned for investigators to find the wreckage, conclude that Flight N447 had crashed in a storm, and close the case without ever discovering the truth about what had happened to the passengers. Instead, that piece of twisted metal had become the key to exposing crimes that spanned continents and revealed the existence of criminal networks more sophisticated and dangerous than anyone had imagined. Dr. Morrison approached Sarah as the memorial service concluded, carrying a small bouquet of flowers that he placed in the sand where the wing had been discovered. His voice was steady as he spoke, but his words carried the weight of everything he had endured to reach this moment. "They thought they could make us disappear without a trace," he said quietly. "But every crime leaves evidence. Every evil act creates consequences. Sometimes it just takes the right person to connect the pieces." As the families departed and the beach returned to its peaceful state, Sarah realized that this case had taught her something fundamental about justice and truth. The victims of Flight N447MA had died because they had stumbled onto secrets that powerful people would kill to protect. But their deaths had ultimately exposed those secrets and brought down the very criminals who had murdered them. The Bermuda Triangle would always be associated with mystery and disappearance, but now it also represented something else: the principle that truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep it's buried beneath the waves. In the end, the 8 souls who had vanished into these waters had not died in vain. Their sacrifice had prevented countless future victims and exposed a level of corruption that had infected institutions throughout South Florida and beyond. If this story left you as impacted as it did me, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and comment your opinion below. Each comment is like a new piece that can help unravel other mysteries like this one. Because in a world where evil often seems to triumph, sometimes the most important thing we can do is remember that justice, like the tide, always finds a way to reach the shore.